I realised that without all that food, all those traditional dishes, that there would be such a big gap in my life, because I realised how important the dishes are to my cultural heritage and how food is such an integral part of identity.
Hey everybody, it's Dani Valent here with you for an episode of Dirty Linen's Summer Series. I'm chatting to fabulous food folk from around the country to talk to them about when they realised food was important to them. I know for me, food is so threaded through the key moments in my life. And when I think about the time that I realised I wanted to write about food and think about food for the rest of my life, I was in Istanbul. I was a travel writer who was becoming a food writer. I was going down a laneway to discover the best yogurt in town. And yeah, it was a really transformative moment for me when I realised that food intersects through every part of life. History, culture, immigration, economics, religion, family stories, love. It's just so rich and endlessly fascinating and a site of learning. So I'm sure we're going to do a bit more of all of that today with our guest, Elana Benjamin. Elana is a freelance writer and home cook whose writing has been published widely in some of the same places as mine. Good Weekend, Sunday Life, Sydney Morning Herald, also the Jewish Independent and Tablet magazine. Elana's written a book called Indian Jewish Food, Recipes and Stories from the Backstreets of Bondi. It was published in 2024 by the Sydney Jewish Museum. Elana, so happy to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Dani.
Really good to have you on the show. Tell us a little bit about your latest book.
So as you said, my cookbook's called Indian Jewish Food, Recipes and Stories from the Backstreets of Bondi. It's a collection of 32 recipes which reflect the cuisine of India's Baghdadi Jews who immigrated to Australia mostly in the 1950s and 60s. Just to give you a bit of context, India was home to 3 Jewish communities, including one which was originally from Iraq, and they're called the Baghdadi Jews. These Baghdadi Jews from India were mostly from Bombay and Calcutta, as those cities were called at the time. They're now obviously Mumbai and Kolkata. And they began immigrating to Australia in the late 1940s. And a lot of them settled in Sydney's eastern suburbs, especially Bondi. What's interesting to me is this was well before the end of the very shameful White Australia policy and well before the first trickle of Indian immigrants to Australia, which was mostly in the 1960s. And obviously the White Australia policy applied equally to everyone. For the most part, though, India's Jews, not all of them, but most of them were pale-skinned enough that they were allowed to come. I'll tell you a quick story, which is one of my aunties actually was given permission to immigrate from Bombay to Sydney in, I think it was 1961, and she was pregnant and she had to wait till her baby was born to make sure the baby wasn't too dark. So, you know, the White Australia policy did apply equally to Jews from India. Anyway, my family was part of Bombay's Baghdadi Jewish community. Both my mum and dad were born and grew up in Bombay, and they left in the 60s. My dad's family came to Sydney. My mum's went to Los Angeles. My dad was 22, my mum was 17. To cut a really long story short, they got married in Sydney in 1970, and my brother and I were born here in Sydney. So coming back to the cookbook captures the traditional Indian Jewish cuisine of my family and of India's Baghdadi Jewish community. So as soon as I say Indian Jewish food, people go, well, what is Indian Jewish food, and what makes it different to regular Indian food? So we'll say that the food of Jewish communities around the world has always been influenced by the cuisine of the countries they live in, and it was the same for the Jews of India. Iraqi Jews started moving to India around the late 18th century, and they kept up their old cooking traditions. But then in India, a lot of them employed Indian cooks, and these local Indian cooks began to introduce their own spices and ingredients to traditional Iraqi dishes. For example, there's a dish in my book called hamim, which is a slow-cooked chicken and rice dish, which also has tomato and spices and egg. And it's evolved, the Indian version, the Indian Jewish version, has evolved to include Indian spices like cardamom and cinnamon and garam masala and fresh ginger. So also at the same time, as these traditional Iraqi dishes became influenced by Indian cuisine, India's Jews adopted a range of typical Indian foods, things like dal and chapatis and bhajis, which are dry vegetable curries, and even nankatai biscuits, which are delicious Indian shortbread biscuits. Many Hindus are vegetarian, and a lot of popular Indian dishes are compatible with the Jewish dietary laws of kashrut, of keeping kosher, which prohibit the mixing of meat and dairy in the same meal. So when I think about Indian Jewish cuisine and when I describe it to people, I put it in these kind of two categories. The first category is those dishes I talked about, which combine Iraqi and Indian cooking. And for the most part, those dishes can't be bought commercially, like the hamim that I mentioned earlier. The dishes are pretty much only made in home kitchens, and they're definitely made in the kitchens of, say, the Sephardi synagogue in Sydney and the one in Melbourne, and also in the kitchen of there's a synagogue in the suburb of Kulaba in Mumbai called the Knesset Eliyahu Synagogue, and they still make those traditional Iraqi Indian Jewish dishes. I was in India almost a year ago this time, and we were there on a Friday night, and after the synagogue service, they served this amazing food, which is like typical of my family and community's cuisine. Anyway, I digress. The second group of dishes are Indian dishes which are compatible with a kosher diet, the kinds of things that you would find if you went to an Indian restaurant and you looked at the vegetarian menu, something like an aloo gobi, a cauliflower and potato bhaji. And the collection of recipes in my book, I've divided it into 5 sections. There's sides, vegetarian, fish and chicken, which is one section together, meat and sweet. And some of the dishes have unique names that are like Iraqi Indian mashups. Like there's one called bamia kata. Bamia is the Arabic word for okra, which people also know as lady's fingers, and kata means sour in Hindi. So that is like perfect examples of how the Iraqi and Indian cuisine got fused together. There's another dish I love the name, it's called chakla bakla, which is pickled vegetables, which kind of is like what it sounds like. It's just like a mishmash. And there's another dish called chitarni, which is a tomato-based chicken curry made with vinegar. And just the other day, I read an article about an Indian restaurant in New York. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called Bungalow, and it's apparently known for its authentic Indian culinary experience. Anyway, Jeff Bezos and his partner recently ate there, hence the article. And this Indian Jewish dish that I mentioned earlier of chicken chitarni is on the menu. It's in my book. So I thought that was super interesting that it's kind of been revived in sort of more mainstream Indian cuisine.
Wow, Elana. Like, I'm just so blown away by everything that you've said. I feel like, as a Jewish person myself, like I really wasn't aware that there was an Indian Jewish Australian community or cuisine. But now that you talk about the synagogue in Mumbai, I do remember stumbling upon it and being amazed because I'm pretty obsessed with Indian food, but now I feel like you've opened so many doors for me to further my interest and eating obsessions. So thank you.
It makes me so happy. And to let you know, you are like most people don't know about Jews from India. They were really a very small community. So like even at their peak, there were only 5,000 of the Baghdadi Jews, and then they didn't all come to Australia. They, dispersed to various countries. So they're very small communities that people don't know much about. So you are not alone.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I'm so thrilled that you've written the book. I mean, has it been fermenting for you for a long time, or was there something that was there a turning point for you that made you feel like, no, this is the time to do it?
No, it hasn't been fermenting. It wasn't fermenting for a long time. Um, Last year, my mum turned 75, and I had a moment, and I can't tell you what precipitated that moment. But I had a moment. It was sort of in the lead up to Jewish New Year, where she does a lot of cooking and especially baking of traditional Iraqi, Indian, Jewish pastries and dishes. Things like they're called date barbers, which are date-filled biscuits, and karkas, which are ring-shaped biscuits, and what we call cheese samosas, which originally were called cheese sambuzak by the Arabic name. And there's a vegan jelly called agar agar. Anyway, she's kind of busy baking them. I had a moment of, if God forbid something happened to my mum tomorrow, you know, that idea, like if someone got run over by a bus tomorrow, God forbid, all of her recipes would be lost. And I wouldn't know how to make most of the dishes because I never bothered. I cooked all the time, but she would cook all this traditional food and my dad would drop it over to our house. So I never really bothered to learn. And so really that was the catalyst for me writing the cookbook, because I didn't want the recipes to get lost. I mean, they weren't really recipes in the sense that she had notes to herself. They were completely impossible for anyone to replicate. But I mean, so I didn't want the dishes to get lost. I wanted to learn how to make them. And there are, like, my oldest aunt is 92. She was 91 at the time. She didn't really cook, doesn't really cook anymore, though she was an amazing cook. So I really felt that the responsibility was with me. I have a brother who was never going to be the one to take on, you know, preserving the recipes. So that was the catalyst for writing the cookbook.
Wow, such an important project. Elana, let's get to the nub of this podcast, which is you sharing a story about when you realised how important food is to you.
So it's actually the same story. Yours was very specific, of like remembering exactly where you were when you had the moment of realising where, you know, how important food was to you. I can't remember where I was. I can tell you I was in Sydney. Other than that, it was this moment, you know, of thinking, you know, my mum is getting older and the recipes are going to be lost. And I realised that without all that food, all those traditional dishes, that there would be such a big gap in my life, because I realised how important the dishes are to my cultural heritage and how food is such an integral part of identity. Like, so much of family life centres around food. Not just, you know, there are obviously dishes specific to particular holidays. So when I think of Jewish New Year, there's a dish called apple jam that Iraqi Jews make. It's very sweet. It's got cardamom in it, to signify the hope that the year ahead will be sweet. But it's just like the everyday dishes, you know, like the yellow rice that we eat with ordinary meals during the week, and maybe potato bhaji and chicken roast and potato that my mum likes to make on a Friday night. And for me, that food is so important, because it's sort of what you talked about. Food is a connection to family and to love and to heritage. It's also for me linked to my grandparents, especially my grandmothers. My Nana Hannah, who used to cook an Indian Jewish feast for our extended family every Saturday night when I was growing up. My dad's one of 9 children, and all except one of his siblings came to Australia from India. And his mother also came, my Nana. My grandfather died in India before I was born. Anyway, every Saturday evening, all my aunts and uncles and cousins would congregate at Nana's like small 2-bedroom apartment in Bondi. She didn't have a lot of material possessions. It was a rental. Bondi was not an affluent place in the 70s. But she cooked the most amazing food. My favourite dish that she made was a dish called aloo makala, which is actually probably the most famous Indian Jewish dish of all. Aloo makala is a hybrid word. They're basically deep fried potatoes. Aloo is potato in Hindi and makala is fried in Arabic. And the dish was from Calcutta's Baghdadi Jewish community. And they were so good. There were never any leftovers. I will say that the recipe is not in my cookbook because they're really unhealthy. I found out in the research, in my research for the book, that the potatoes are actually soaked in oil for hours, sometimes for a day. I know. Can you imagine before they were cooked, which is obviously why they tasted so good. Yeah, so my mum never actually made alamacolors because I think she was a bit more health conscious than my nana. But in my research, I also found out that taste is like a really effective, I think one of the most effective sensations for encoding memory. It's probably been, I would say 30 years since I've last eaten one of Nana Hannah's alamacolors, but I can still remember exactly what they taste like. I don't know, Dani, is it the same for you? Are there any dishes from your kind of childhood or young adulthood that you loved that you haven't eaten in a long time that you can still remember the taste and just connect you to good times and happy feelings?
Yeah, honestly, there's a couple that come up that my Hungarian Jewish grandmother would make for us. One of them is her cholent, so a very traditional bean and meat stew that was often eaten on the Sabbath because you could start cooking it the day before. So very stodgy, very sticky, and I can really remember the just the mouth coating gelatinous feeling of it, and I can just really remember the fullness after eating it. But somehow I would still always have room for her. I want to say Turos gombot, but I feel like that's really bad Hungarian, but we translated it as golden balls. So it was this sort of this stovetop dumpling, golden syrup, I think, dumpling that would reach the top of the saucepan. It was sort of balls that were formed and dropped into a pot. So they all sort of stuck together, but they were somehow separated by this sticky caramel. So I remember the crunchiness on the outside of those dumplings and the sort of slightly airy but sticky stodginess within. And and also, again, it's a dish that stays in the mouth because you get little, it's just sticky. So that's a couple of things that come to mind for me.
Really yum.
Yeah, so good. So yeah, I can really relate to this memory of yours, this sense memory that's so embedded. I think one of the things you've talked about, through this chat, this melding of words, I'm so taken by that as well. And, it's just such the names of those dishes, the mixing of the Arabic and the Hindi, just tells such a story of the entwined cultures and the huge journeys and this, this carrying with. I just absolutely love it. Really love it and feel very educated by you and very uplifted as well by the fact that you've retained this heritage and these family stories that you're now bringing to a broader audience.
Well, thank you. And thank you for helping me bring it to a broader audience. I'll also say, now that I'm an adult with children of my own, I really appreciate, in fact, I'm in awe of how much time and effort and love my nana put into cooking for us each week and how the food was so integral in bringing us together. And I wanted to be able to recreate that, not exactly the same, but to be able to cook the food as a way of, showcasing culture, which people don't know about, and also as a way of bringing people together and to bring joy into people's lives because there's, lots of hardship going on at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Elana, we've talked about potatoes soaked in oil, which perhaps isn't the recipe I want you to share with us now, but do you have a summary dish that you could talk us through that maybe we could get a taste and sensory insight into this style of food?
So when I think about a summary dish from the book, the one that springs to mind is a dish called chickpea, which are spiced chickpeas and potatoes in a tamarind sauce. And earlier I spoke about those two categories of Indian Jewish food. This chickpea it's an Indian dish. It's not Iraqi at all. It's one that the Indian Jews, adopted from their Indian hosts. It's a street food snack. It's really easy to make. And the flavour, what I consider the superstar flavour in this dish is tamarind, which is a souring agent. And you can buy tamarind concentrate these days, unlike in the old days. Now you can buy it in the Indian section of major supermarkets. You can get it at Indian grocery stores. and even on Amazon. You just have to make sure you get tamarind concentrate and not tamarind puree, which are slightly different. Chopped potato is great in summer because you serve it at room temperature and you could even serve it cold. So it's really easy. You get, the quantities are in my book, but you get a couple of potatoes, chop them, dice them into reasonably large dice, and you boil them until they're soft. You can do that a day before, and then once they cool, whack them in the fridge. Then you open a tin of chickpeas, drain it, put the potatoes and chickpeas in a big bowl, and then you add spices. So the spices are ground cumin, ground coriander, obviously paprika. If you like chili powder, go for your life. You can add as much chili as you like to make it as spicy as you like. I don't have huge chili tolerance, which is a source of embarrassment. I don't know why. My brother and my daughter can take huge amounts of chili, somehow managed to, that gene skipped me. You chop some red onion, put some salt, some lemon, and then the tamarind paste, which is quite thick the tamarind concentrate when you take it out of the container. So it just needs to be diluted with some warm water to thin it out. You mix it all through. And the last thing is to chop fresh coriander, the leaves and stems, and sprinkle them on top. I know coriander is a really divisive herb. Some people just don't like it. So if you don't like coriander, you would just leave it out. And that's it. You mix it all together and you eat it. It's a really easy, light, summery snack. Because of the chickpeas, it's got protein. You could also, if you wanted it you wanted a more substantial meal, you could serve it alongside a piece of fish or chicken. You could have it with some bread if you wanted. It's like really quite versatile and I think really yummy.
Oh, it sounds so good and so easy as well. I could imagine if I was organised on I knew that a hot day was coming, I'd pre-cook the potatoes, have them in the fridge, and then I could just tumble that together for an easy lunch or dinner. So good. Elana, thank you for sharing that with us and for everything that you've brought to us today. So grateful to you for your time and for your collection of recipes. Really, I just cannot wait to dive into the book. Thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dani.
This is Dirty Linen, and I'm Dani Valent. We air the issues that the hospitality industry finds hard to talk about, hearing from different people with unique perspectives. We want to hear from you as well. If you have something that needs to be said about a topic, get in touch so we can include your perspective. Contact us at dirtylinen@deepintheweeds.com.au or hit us up on Insta at Dirty Linen Podcast. We can't wait to hear from you.
This